Firstly, just at the outset, I want to put on record my support for this bill, and I think it is a very important piece of legislation. The facts in Ireland are borne out by revenue statistics and economic research. Recently published the fact that in relation to our own alcohol consumption per capita in Ireland, that it's increased nearly 5% up to 2016 year on year, and that per head Irish people are drinking 11.46 litres of pure alcohol per annum, which is equivalent to nearly 500 pints of beer a year, 46 bottles of vodka a year, or 130 bottles of wine. So we have a problem, and the country does have a problem, and there is an issue with alcohol consumption, and with with our country's relationship with alcohol. And that doesn't mean it's all negative either. But the measures within this bill, in my view, to protect the most vulnerable, and particularly our children, and the normalisation of it through advertising, are very much welcome now. My colleague, Deputy Brannock, has mentioned some very valid concerns that relate to the jobs in the industry and the sector. I think that can be managed through. But I want to talk very briefly about my own position as chairperson of the North Dublin Regional Drugs and Alcohol Task Force, and a task force that I've actually chaired for nearly 5 years now. And whilst the government have, and rightly so, put a lot of effort into this piece of legislation and have a lot of focus and commitment to this legislation, and that is welcome, but it's not the silver bullet. And what I don't see in tandem with this is increased support on the ground. If you take, under the new National Drugs and Alcohol Strategy that's been published by Minister Byrne, that it is now put in place the Community Action on Alcohol, and has actually asked each of the 14 local drugs task forces and the 10 regional drugs and alcohol task forces to implement the Community Action on Alcohol. And I actually think that's a really good idea, because that's actually how each community deals with alcohol in their community. Not to ban it, or not to shun it or park it away, but actually for the communities themselves to take a role in how alcohol is perceived, right the way through events. If you take in Fingal, in my own area, getting our local authorities involved, getting our sports clubs involved. But each of those areas need an extra, at minimum, of €45,000, small beer, if you excuse the pun, to actually implement these, and we don't have that money. And I would ask you, Minister, through your own colleagues, to look at how each of the areas are resourced to implement the Community Action on Alcohol. I think we need to do that. What I would also say to you is, if you take all the task force areas, take my own in North Dublin, the catchment area of 330,000 people, we haven't had an increase in funding in 8 years. Our funding for the whole service is $777,000 per annum for 300,000 people. We don't even have an education prevention worker in that area of North Dublin. So we talk about the legislation, and I welcome that, absolutely. But then we've actually got to talk about what's happening on the ground. In my own area in Swords, we set up a community care team because there wasn't one. There was none for that whole North County Dublin area. And we had to pull funding from other projects to employ people directly. And we've seen over 1,000 people have been treated through that service, based out of Swords, with outreach into places like Rush and Malahide, and all the way through the North County. But we didn't get one extra cent for that. We've been doing it ourselves. So I think when government talks about the need to legislate to protect people against the ills of alcohol, or to at least redress the balance, absolutely. But then let's put your money where your mouth is on the other side of things, to deal with issues like education, like treatment, like rehabilitation, that in large swathes of the country just simply aren't available. So I think as part of this debate on second stage, and as we get through committee stage on this bill, that I'm saying, as a chair of a regional drugs and alcohol task force, I support this wholeheartedly. And there will be issues for industry to deal with, and I think that will have to be worked through. But what I'd love to see, the same commitment from government, is to say, you know what? There's a good job being done by our community sector and by the HSE on the ground, but they're wholly under-resourced. And if we want to stop people falling into problematic drinking in particular, and I'm just focusing on drinking, then we've got to resource them. So how is that the case when we publish a new National Drugs and Alcohol Strategy, which I welcome? It's published, no additional resources. Community Action on Alcohol, no additional resources. So we need that, and I'm asking you, Minister, and I'll be saying it to Minister Byrne. I believe there's a meeting on the 28th of this month, but we need government support, and certainly something from the Fianna Fáil perspective, through our own spokesperson in this area, Jack Chambers, that I'm serious that we can actually make and effect real change from the ground up. Legislation's from here down, and that's setting the rules. But if you don't change how we operate on the ground within our communities, this bill and this act in itself is not going to protect people. and it's not going to change people's lives, but we can only change that through our communities, and that's why I think community action on alcohol is a really important part of the strategy. But let's resource it. Let's resource our regional drugs and our local drugs and alcohol task forces properly, because that's where we're making real interventions and real strides with this. So I would ask you to take those points on board, and I look forward to seeing this bill come through at the committee stage. But let's resource the people on the ground who are doing the real work to protect our kids against alcohol and drug abuse.